All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us right on time. I know we've got people joining from all over the world, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. As is our tradition for our virtual events, you can go ahead and jump in the chat and say hello. Let us know where you're joining us from today. We'll see who's here. Hey, Claire, first one. Claire in Berlin. James in London. Hey, David. Well, good representation so far. Berlin, London, and Paris. Munich, Paris. I'm sure we've got some US folks waking up with us. Hello, Brussels. Hannah in Cambridge. Toronto, SoCal. Cool. Wonderful. Okay, well, we'll let everyone join there. And Pete is joining us from Austin, Texas today. I'm in Paris. We've got all the map covered. All right, awesome. Lots of people joining. Well, great. I know we're going to have folks logging in here. So the first couple minutes, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. So my name's Dominique. I'm on the community team at CFO Connect, which is a global community for finance leaders. And I see a lot of our members here today. Nice to see some familiar names joining us again. So as a finance community, we host events and workshops like this one. We have a private Slack group for CFOs and produce lots of helpful content on our blog and our podcast, which is called CFO Yeah. Check it out on Apple, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you're not officially a member yet, it is free to join the community. Just need to submit a quick application at cfoconnect.eu. All right. And the community, CFO Connect, was created by Spendesk. If you're not familiar with Spendesk yet, it is the go-to spend and expense management solution made for modern finance teams. So essentially, it lets you spend less time on tedious admin tasks and more time on work that adds real value to your business, which I think we can all get behind. So if that sounds interesting, you can go ahead and check out spendesk.com, and CFO Connect members get to try it for free. Okay, so on to today's topic. We are thrilled to have Startup Growth Advisor Pete Hancock with us today to share his experience on how to optimize sales and revenue for growth. And Pete is definitely qualified to speak to this, having been an operator and a sales leader at iconic tech companies like Yelp and Knock, and now working as a growth advisor, helping companies to scale their sales teams, increase productivity, and develop new revenue channels. So I have personally been able to see Pete's inspiring sales leadership in action when we both worked at Yelp back in the day, and I am certain you'll get some really great takeaways from his talk today. So just a reminder before we jump in, you can ask your questions throughout the presentation. There is a tab specifically for questions. So go ahead and throw them in there. We will pause throughout the presentation to address some of those, and then we'll also have a dedicated Q&A time at the end. So with that, I'm going to officially pass the mic to Pete. Pete, welcome. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, Dominique. Hello, CFO Connect community. Excited to be chatting with you. So why don't we get started? So here's my background. I was an early employee at Yelp. I stayed with the company for 11 years, scaling it from 1 million in annual revenue to 750 million. Lots of different changes in the go-to-market strategy, in the sales strategy and tactics through those years. I was VP of sales for a long time at the company, and I also built the sales training program where we trained thousands of account executives across the country and the world. So now I have experience ranging from Series A to big public companies. And so I'm a consultant and advisor. And so typically working a lot with Series A and Series B, but also above and some C companies as well. So I'm passionate about startups. I'm passionate about bringing new products to market and having sales teams and building sales teams that can do that successfully. So let's get into what we're going to chat about today. So there's a number of topics that come up when I'm chatting with founders or sales leaders at startups, and they're pretty common regardless of the size of the company. So I figured what I do for this group is address some of the most frequently asked questions, hopefully share some insight, and happy to take questions as well as we go through each of these topics. So we'll talk about sales productivity, which is of course on everyone's mind. How do we make our team more productive? We'll talk about sales channels. So this means if you have an inbound ad-driven sales channel, or you're doing outbound sales, reaching out to your customers sort of in a cold outreach type of way. How do you diversify those channels? What are some of the mistakes that are often made with those channels? Most startups go through this stage where they move up market. So they might have a sort of a set group of customers that they're working with in an industry or a size, and they want to expand that over time. So I'm going to dig into some tips for moving up market to mid-market or enterprise customers. And we'll talk a little bit as well about expanding to SME, or as we call it in the States, SMB customers, and some of the common mistakes that are made there and things to kind of look out for. And then finally, presuming we have time, we can talk a little bit about managing remote sales teams. There are some sales groups that have a lot of experience with that. If you've sort of been set up in multiple satellite offices, but there's a lot of sales teams that had inside sales hubs all sort of working in one office, and it's been a big change for them. And I've worked with a number of startups to help them figure that out, and some companies that have moved completely to a distributed model. So I can share some learnings from there, take questions, what have you. For today's session, we're going to really focus on this early scaling stage, which is 1 million to 10 million in annual revenue. So that's sort of the context in which I'll be sharing this information. Of course, once you get above that, you're going to have a lot of the same challenges and a lot of the same things you're thinking about. But hopefully you can get it right when you're at this stage, so you don't have to sort of go and fix things when they're larger, which does happen. So hopefully this will be helpful for everyone who's in that stage, as well as might be approaching that stage, or maybe has successfully moved beyond that stage. I think there'll be some relevant topics as well. So let's dig in. So first topic, focus on sales productivity. What should we be thinking about there? You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the definition for this is sales productivity. So conversion rate from a lead to a paying customer. So how effectively is your sales team converting leads they're getting, whether they're inbound leads that are coming in, or whether you have a set of outbound leads that fit your ideal customer profile that your team is actively calling. How effective is your team at converting those leads into paying customers? This is obviously the number one question that founders ask me about and need advice on because the team is new and they're figuring things out. So this is really driven by two things. So one is strength of product market fit, and that really varies by the customer, as well as the sales team effectiveness. So I'll give you a couple tips for these two, and we'll take it from there. So a little story here about product market fit and how it varies depending on the customer you're going after, and how it can have a huge impact on sales productivity. So Yelp is really an app and a website that people use to find all sorts of local businesses, but especially restaurants. Obviously, before this past challenging year, people were dining out a lot more often and going to restaurants multiple times per week or per month, depending on how you had things set up. And so people were always searching for restaurants on Yelp. It's really where it got its start. And so as we started selling advertising to local businesses in the early days, we of course focused on restaurants. That's what people were using the app for. That's what people were writing reviews about restaurants. And that's really where all the traffic was. And over time, we started to see these other categories pop up. So categories like auto repair, plumbers, etc. And interestingly, people started writing reviews about them and people started searching for them, but we hadn't really figured out how to contact these businesses yet. But over time, what we found was because of the product market fit for home services, if you took two businesses like Laura, which is a great barbecue place here in Austin, and Kelty Services, which is a small local plumber, Laura might have thousands, tens of thousands of people reading about it on Yelp every single month. Kelty Services, a small plumber, might only have 10 or 15. But the product market fit was so much stronger in the home services category that we saw such a lift in sales productivity. And this is one of the things in the early stage of figuring out your go-to-market strategy. It's important to focus on different verticals and different types of businesses if you have a product that can be sold to all of them, to really understand your customers and understand the product market fit. So this day, home services makes up 30 to 40% of Yelp's annual revenue, while restaurants only makes up 10%, despite the fact that from a usage basis, restaurants has 2-3 times the amount of usage from consumers. And so this is all about finding the right product market fit, where you have the biggest strength. And as I like to say with startups, you've got to win where you can win and focus on that, and then figure out the next place you can win. Don't go too broad. So we'll get into some of the questions here on the next slide that you should be thinking about and asking about. This is basic stuff around market positioning, figuring out who your customer is, and really putting yourself in the shoes of the customer to understand where you have the best product market fit. So again, a lot of times startups don't have the sales productivity that they want. So the first thing I do is I ask them, who's your ideal customer? Who delivers who does your product deliver the most value to? And really try and put the sales leader or the CEO in the shoes of that customer. So asking yourself basic questions like, who are you selling to? Who cares about the product? Who gets value from the product? Not just from a vertical specific basis, but also from who's the buyer at that company. Is it a small business owner? Is it a VP of marketing? Is it a VP of operations? Who's going to make that purchase decision? What do they care about as it relates to their focus with the company? And what do they care about personally as far as what they're tasked at that job? Those are the types of questions you want to ask to get to know them. What are they buying? Why should they pay attention to your product? So what are they hoping to get, from your product? And sometimes what you're selling to them is a little bit different than what they're actually buying. I'll give you an example. For restaurants on Yelp, oftentimes they cared about the way the restaurant was being viewed on Yelp, the brand perception, the photos, things like that. And so we built an enhanced profile for those businesses so they could showcase some of their favorite photos and do things like that. That's something that they really cared about. Home services, plumbers, all they cared about was getting new customers. They didn't care what the page looked like. So although we were selling the same product to each person, they had different, sort of needs and wants from the product. Why are they going to buy? Why now? And then also, how are they going to see that the product is driving them results? Restaurants, they don't know where people are finding them when they come in the door necessarily. They can ask, but that's really challenging to do. Plumbers, before they book that appointment, the first question they ask is, how did you hear about us? So they could see that they were getting a lot of business from Yelp. So really understanding the product market fit that you have for a customer and making sure you win where you can win on the early stages is how you can drive productivity forward. And this will change as you scale. So you might get a certain amount of penetration with a particular customer. Now you've got to look out and do this exercise all over again to determine where's the next place to focus. So I'll get into an example here. Early stage company that I've been working with, Series A company called Avocado, which has a text messaging, live chat product, a very successful startup who's scaling their business rapidly right now. When we decided to layer on an outbound sales motion to their ad-driven inbound sales model, we had to look at all of the wide range of customers that they have, and we had to focus vertical by vertical to understand where the product market fit was strongest. So then when we started doing outbound sales, we wanted to make sure we were aligning that team against that. And what we found was vacation rental companies before 2020 was a great category for this company because vacation rental is B2C. So you're selling a B2B product, but their consumers they're B2C. And so when it came to a text messaging product for communicating with their customers, we found that businesses that were B2C had a much stronger product market fit because their consumers would rather get messages versus emails or something like that. And so this is what we discovered, and we were able to build a whole outbound sales strategy around the vacation rental category and other B2C categories. If we had focused on every single category where we were seeing customers and inbound leads coming in, we wouldn't have seen as much conversion and productivity.
Quick question, Pete, on both of those examples where you discovered kind of an untapped opportunity, did that come from looking at certain data points, or was it purely anecdotal feedback from the sales team? How did those discoveries come about?
Yeah, so hopefully with the inbound channel, it was easy because we were able to see where we were getting inbound leads from and what sort of categories and verticals were drawn to the product. And then we just had to have conversations. Really, there are no shortcuts, I think, for doing this. You have to talk to customers. And this is one of the most important things when a CEO or a sales leader says, hey, our productivity isn't where it needs to be. Well, what's the last conversation you had with a customer? You've got to chat with them. You've got to understand who's buying the product, why they're buying it, how they're measuring and valuing the product. So, I think you have a hunch, right? You know the business, you know your customers, but really going in and understanding them on a vertical basis needs and requires one-on-one conversations. Then you start to see patterns, right? So we saw this pattern where vacation rentals was really strong. We said, why? Well, the reason why is because their customers really liked the product. And if you're selling a product that helps them communicate better with their customers, then that's a win-win type scenario. So really no big shortcuts there, using your intuition, but talking to customers is super important to do. And then looking for those patterns that then really you can see applying across the whole vertical or the whole set of customers is the best way to do it. And I would say smaller the better. So you've got to pick one, and then you've got to either prove or disprove if this is the right vertical to focus on. And then you move on to the next one is generally what I recommend as you're having these types of conversations.
Okay, great. Super helpful. Thank you.
Cool. So the second part of sales productivity is, okay, let's say you've got the team focused on the right verticals, focused on the right categories, etc. How effective is the team itself? How effective is what we call the sales motion, or the go-to-market strategy, the sales and marketing motion combined? And there's really three things that I like to look at and do an evaluation of day one to determine where the opportunity to improve sales productivity is. First off is the people, the strength of the team. How aligned are they with the mission of the company? Do they believe in the value of the product? Do they have confidence in the value of the product? How well of a fit are they for the sales role that they're in, whether it's an inbound or an outbound sales role, an SDR role where they're setting appointments, or an account executive role where they're responsible for revenue. Looking at the team very critically. And one of the most important things you can do, if you can afford to do it in the early stages of scaling a sales team, is to constantly be bringing in new sales representatives or account executives. So if you can hire one or two people every month, every quarter, whatever that time period is, having new people come in the door gives you a baseline to understand, okay, do we have an opportunity to level up the team here? Or do we actually have a really strong team, and the new people that we're bringing in, there's a long ramp up for doing that? It's really the only way to know. Now, of course, you can evaluate people based off of metrics and things like that, but the benefit of when you're scaling a sales team is hopefully you're bringing in new people on a somewhat regular basis. And if you're doing a great job hiring, hopefully you're able to get some good people in the door, and you can start to understand what characteristics, what people really do well, and then also build a diverse team. And so you don't want just one type of salesperson. You want a variety of different salespeople, introverts, extroverts, all different types of backgrounds. It's important to have a diverse team so you can understand and have a team that can win where they can win with different types of customers. On the process side, this is the second thing to look at. So this is really understanding, okay, what are the tactics? How are you communicating? Are you communicating over email? Are you communicating over phone? Are you communicating over text message? Are you communicating over social channels? What does the cadence of the communication look like? So how much outreach are you doing once you get in touch with someone? How sort of aggressive or non-aggressive are you? How consultative are you? When you're contacting a company, are you focusing on one person, or are you reaching out to multiple decision makers or influencers across the organization? Really understanding what the process is that the team is doing in order to contact, generate appointments, and then ultimately win business is important to understand. You could have a great salesperson, two great salespeople, but if they're going about things in a different way, one might lead with email while the other one's more comfortable making cold calls. You're going to see a big difference in productivity between those two people. And so understanding what the right cadence of messaging is super important. And you've got to think about your customer and what do they do on a day-to-day basis? What are they thinking about? Are they in front of their email? Are they on the go? And build a process around that can really work, and you can communicate with them in the right way. So that's the second thing that I dig into. There's very common mistakes that I see on the process side. Generally, the most common mistake I see is too slow of a sales process. And so if you have someone that's a good fit for the product and they're interested, you want to build a buying process for them that is easy, it fits within their timeline, and they can go about it very quickly if they want to get started. I often see salespeople, drag out their outreach, say, oh, well, you're busy right now, let me give you a call next week. If they're actually interested in the product and they could benefit from the product, then see if they'll prioritize a phone call or a follow-up for the next day. If they won't, that's okay, but that will give you a sense of how good of a fit is it for them, how important is it for them, versus sort of spacing out every call 1 week, then 1 week, then 1 week. So there's common things that I see around the process that can be improved, and that's one of them. This is, of course, I could give a whole hour-long presentation on this, so we'll move on. And then the next part is the product itself. And when I say product, that's the sales product, so the messaging. So the scripts, the presentations, the demo videos, all of these assets that the sales team has, the one-pagers, the decks, the questions, so the list of questions that they ask to understand their customer better. This is all the sales messaging. This is all the sales product, as I like to say. And of course, this can have a huge impact on productivity. If you have a great set of questions that helps your sales team identify who's the right fit for your product, then that can have a huge difference than just kind of letting them wing it one-off. And so these are the three things that I look at. And if you have a VP of sales or a head of sales at your startup that you're working at now, you want to be looking at all three different buckets and not get too lost in one of them. I see startups focus on, we've got to get a better deck, we need a demo video, we need more collateral from marketing. Maybe that's true, but maybe you actually don't have the right team. Maybe you've got people who have been in the role for too long and it's time for them to move on to a different stage in their career. Maybe they don't want to do sales anymore. These are very common things in sales. It's a challenging profession. So making sure you've got the right group who's aligned with your customers and really believes in the product is typically the first thing I want to look at before we start thinking about things like collateral, so on and so forth. So.
Great. And I'll just pause here to say, I know with our finance community, we have a lot of discussions around metrics and the right metrics to track. So certainly if you have questions for Pete about sales efficiency, metrics, payback period, all of that, feel free to ask because I think that's very relevant to this group. Otherwise, we will keep moving.
Cool. Yeah, happy to dig into that. And if we have time at the end, we can chat about some of those metrics as well and talk about that, comp plans and payback periods, as you said. So diversifying sales channels. So this is super important. So I'll dig right into it if you could go to the next slide. So defining the sales channels here. So you have the inbound sales channels. So you have ad-driven channels, which is more of a push. You're advertising, whether you're doing search engine marketing, or you're doing social ads or some other ad platform, or you're building content and you're pulling people in to then request information or learn more or what have you. So inbound leads, outbound leads, of course, reaching out to them over email, phone, or social, or partners. So distribution partners, or maybe you might have a reseller team where you actually have a partner who's selling your product. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these, some of the things to focus on. I think generally you have to understand that each channel that you have, each inbound channel that you have, if you start to layer on outbound sales, each of them are going to be a completely unique funnel that will have their own unique set of costs and timelines. And so one of the mistakes, or one of the things you want to think about, is if you start to launch a new channel, you want to see, okay, if we're going to start doing content, for example, and we're going to build an inbound channel around content, you need to think about, okay, which customer, where are they in the adoption curve of your product? Where are they, and how's this content going to go after them? And what's their mindset going to be when they engage with your content or when they drive this channel? And how do you build the right content around that? And then how do you build the right sales motion around that? There was a startup that I was working with when we launched outbound sales, and we started to go to enterprise sales and larger customers. And we found immediately that these larger customers were not doing searches on Google for the product. They were not engaging really with ads that much. A little bit on LinkedIn, some content ads on LinkedIn. What we found was they really needed to be more educated on why they should use this type of product and why they should adopt this type of innovation before they could even be interested. So we really had to start to build more content, webinars, blog posts, things like that around why the product matters. And so chances are we weren't going after the innovators here. We were maybe going after some of the early adopters or some of the early majority. And that just by nature was where they were at in that channel. And so if we were going to make that channel work, we realized that the timeline for that channel was going to be much more drawn out, because we had to sort of educate the community first before we could begin selling them, which was totally different than the inbound leads that were coming in via advertising. It involves a different type of sales motion. The payback periods are going to be much longer. The type of account executive you need who's doing that type of sale is going to be very different than an account executive who's handling inbound leads who are coming at you. And so thinking about the unique funnel for each inbound channel and then the outbound channels, what are the unique costs, what are the unique timelines, is something you want to do as sort of a pre-analysis before you start launching a channel. Or at least you want to have a sense of what metrics to look at in the early days once you launch it, before you kind of put too many eggs in one basket and say, hey, this is going to be a huge new channel for us. Cool. So some common mistakes, making assumptions about ad-driven inbound channels. I'm sure anyone, as far as this community, you're allocating dollars if you have advertising channels to drive inbound leads. So you've probably seen in the past, you never want to make any assumptions about it. If it's a great channel, wonderful. That means other companies are going to figure out it's a great channel soon as well, and you can expect your cost of acquisition to go up. Things will change. There's so many advertising channels now where they'll increase pricing over time. There's auto bidding for ads and things like that. And so you never want to make any assumption, and you want to start to understand what's the runway that we have for this channel. So how long do we think this channel can continue to be productive at the certain CAC, customer acquisition costs that we have? And how do you look around the corner a little bit and say, be a little skeptical and say, okay, well, what if something changes about this channel? Then what? Can we afford to invest more? Do we need to start investing in other channels now? Another common mistake that I see is inaccurate forecasting around the outbound conversion rate. And so, the outbound leads are going to be very, very different. And so from a cold lead to a warm lead, so basically going from 0 to 1, where you're reaching out, they don't even know about the product, they don't even know about your company, and you're able to successfully set an appointment with them, that conversion rate is going to be way different than any sort of ad-driven inbound lead conversion rate. But perhaps most importantly, from a warm lead to an actual closed customer, you're going to see a very different conversion rate normally for outbound leads than you see for inbound leads. And I think sometimes we make an assumption that, well, if we can get an appointment, if we can get the right decision maker on the phone, if they actually have a need, we start to apply some of the conversion rates that we have from other channels to an outbound channel, and we need to be very conservative about that, particularly when we're starting, because again, they might be at a different place in the adoption curve or in the buying process. And then as far as partnerships, sorry, did you want to dig into that one? Do you have a question that I could address?
I was wondering, would you recommend diversifying sales channels as soon as possible as an early stage company, or is that something you work up to over time?
Yeah, so it depends on how much money you have. If you can have an outbound team in addition to an inbound team, and a team might be one person, it might be two people, but if you can have someone who's fully dedicated on inbound and fully dedicated on outbound, ideally two people, because as I mentioned earlier, the people can really affect the productivity. And so having sort of two people versus one can be super helpful. If you can do that early on, it's very helpful. I've seen companies that will go and raise, a Series A or a Series B, and they say, we're going to build this new channel with this new round, but they haven't really had a chance to test it and to see what it's going to look like. And it's great if it works, but then if it doesn't, now you're in a tough spot and you've got to find a new channel. So I think the earlier you can start to do outbound, particularly if you have a specific vertical or a specific set of customers that you think gets a lot of value from the product, the earlier you can start that, the better. Because as I said, on ad-driven inbound channels, you just don't have control over them. Things can change very quickly. Whereas on the outbound channels, you have much more control over it, and it can be much more difficult and maybe a little bit more expensive in the beginning, but you have control over it and you have a little bit more predictability, which can be very helpful when it's time to scale. You can say, great, let's go and add 4 people to this team versus, hey, let's build this team from scratch and hope it works. So if you can afford it, yes, for sure.
Okay, great.
Cool. And then last, one more thing on that one is outsourcing sales to partners. I think the big thing about this is I definitely have chatted with early stage startups who say, we've got this great product. Let's work with this other company who's got a big sales team, and we're gonna enable them to sell the product. And that sounds great, but what I will say is you've got to figure out how to sell your own product before you can expect someone else can sell the product for you. And when I built channel teams in the past, not only did we have to figure out how to sell the product ourselves, we then had to educate this whole other team on how to sell the product. We actually had to hold their hand and essentially do co-selling for 6 months together and basically sell for them or sell with them for 6 months before they were able to even do it on their own. And so I think that's really important to think about. You have to understand how to sell your product yourself before you can expect any other company or partner to sell it for you, even if they've got all the relationships with your ideal customer profile already. Cool, so I thought this was an interesting example as far as sort of crossing the chasm and using a new channel to basically accelerate sales kind of for more of a mid-stage startup. And one of the things that we found in the early days at Yelp was there was innovators, there was early adopters. They loved the product as a consumer. So if they ran a small business, they were excited about advertising on Yelp. They were into it. They understood the benefit, they understood the community, and they understood sort of the high purchase intent of it. So, they were early adopters, but what we found was there's only so many of those. And what you've got to do is build additional channels to reach out to people who are later in the adoption curve. And so a couple of years in, we started to layer in a freemium type product where, in this example, this looks to be a contractor or a plumber. This person maybe is less likely to be spending time writing reviews on Yelp and things like that, but they want to communicate with their customers on there. They want to explore as a possible channel. So building a freemium product for them where they could have a free business owner's account, where they could see what was happening, they could see how much traffic their Yelp page was getting, they could respond to reviews, they could do all of these things for free. This became a really good channel for later in the adoption curve. And so this was interesting where we basically layered on freemium in the middle of the company's growth in order to get out to a new set of customers and communicate with them in a way they wanted to be communicated with. And this became first off, it was great just for the local business community to have this free product. And so we were very proud of that. Second off, if they wanted to do self-serve advertising on their own, or if they wanted to be contacted by a sales rep, it made it really easy for us to do that, having this freemium product. So you can layer on different types of channels and go-to-market strategies at any stage. This was probably a few years in, Series C, something like that, when we really started to lean into this strategy, and it paid huge dividends in the years to come. Cool. So we'll talk about moving up market to larger customers, or moving to smaller customers as well. And then we'll wrap things up with remote sales teams. So a couple tips on this, if you could go to the next slide. I really think thinking ahead is important here. And, it's very hard to move up market. There's a lot of things up in the air. You're thinking about your marketing. You're thinking about, does the product even work for these customers in the same way? And you'll get lots of product requests as you start to work with larger companies. They're used to making those types of requests. And so my general advice is here. One is, you should definitely see some pull from larger customers. There needs to be some level of interest. Maybe they're, emailing in saying, can you tell me about this? Maybe you've got a competitor in the marketplace and you're starting to see some larger companies work with them. There should be some sort of pull that indicates like, okay, we can actually help these larger enterprises. Our product can actually help them. Generally, this is going to require outbound sales and marketing. They're not going to come to you as much. As you're working with larger companies, you're starting to work with buyers who are thinking about their job security actually before they implement new products. And that becomes really important to them. And they don't want to be the person who goes out there and implements some new product and goes and does it just kind of willy-nilly on their own. And so you've got to reach out to them. You've got to educate them. You've got to have marketing collateral that will make them feel comfortable. You have to give them collateral that they can share across their organization with their coworkers. And so this is going to require more of an outbound sales and marketing motion. As I mentioned, you'll work across larger organizations. So all of a sudden you might go from working with one or two people to make a purchase decision to working with teams of people. So that requires a unique salesperson who can do that and has done that before. So that becomes very important. And this is a very common mistake I see, which is you might have one or two big customers and they're super happy and they love the product. You don't want to assume that every other big company is going to be just like them. And so they might have signed up for a particular reason. Maybe the buyer is an innovator and is really into that and new products. You need to understand, are there innovators who are buyers at other enterprises, or is this person just kind of unique, before you go and build a whole team around it. And then really importantly is be really careful. Don't change too many things at once. So if you're going to start to sell to larger enterprises, maybe focus on a vertical that has really strong product market fit versus changing a vertical and selling to larger customers at the same time. So that's something super important to think about. Don't build a whole new product thinking this is the product that we need to sell to larger enterprises. Figure out how to sell your existing product to larger enterprises and then layer on some of the features and functionality that they might need, right? Because if you're selling a whole new different product, that's changing too many things at once. So those are just a couple tips for moving up market. This of course varies customer to customer. And then as you're expanding to smaller enterprises, this can be great. If you've got larger customers, if you've got good product market fit, chances are that you can build out sort of a simpler version of the product to deliver a great solution to smaller companies. The challenges are more around the go-to-market strategy and the distribution. And so it can be really difficult to scale messaging across a large set of smaller enterprises. You can't maybe afford to do as much one-on-one personalized messaging because the deal sizes are a lot smaller. So figuring out how to build an outbound marketing strategy when you've got lots of different verticals, lots of different companies can be really challenging. So figuring that out will be really important. And then modeling out your pricing and acquisition costs. I'm sure this audience understands that better than anyone else. Of course, you want to think about what's the right pricing strategy for a smaller enterprise. Does it align with what they can afford? Does it align with the value to them? What are the acquisition costs going to be? Because these are going to be smaller sized customers. How do you make that work? And then what's the churn going to be like? So smaller enterprises, they have less time to do these types of things. They have less resources to invest in these kind of things. They probably might not have a dedicated budget. And so one of the big challenges you'll see here is if they cancel and not use your product, they might just not use any product. They might say, you know what, we can't afford to use this type of product. We're going to go back to pen and paper or whatever we were doing before. Whereas with larger enterprises, they might have a dedicated budget for it and you might be competing with them. And so this can be a real challenge where you have a lot of churn because companies try your product out and they say, you know what, we're just going to go back to the old way of doing things. And smaller businesses are more comfortable with that than maybe an enterprise that needs to see the functionality. So those are just a couple tips on working with smaller businesses. Again, this is a huge topic. Happy to take any questions about this or anything else, because I know this is a big topic.
Well, Christian says this is a great and relevant presentation. So thanks. And thanks, Christian, for saying that. So Pete, in our last webinar, we had a fairly lively discussion around cost like and churn, because we have, different folks who think each of those metrics may be more or less important in terms of like overall business success. So in your experience, have you seen how have you looked at those metrics in terms of a true sense of sales productivity and long-term business success?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question, and it does matter, on the company and sort of the scale that the company is going after, the amount of capital that the company has. There's plenty of B2B SaaS companies who are happy paying from a cost of acquisition perspective, a full year in acquisition cost to acquire a customer, as long as the churn is over 100. And then they start to make money in year 2. From a cash flow perspective, that costs a lot of money to do that, if you don't start making any money until year 2. But you can definitely make that work if you've got the capital and if you've got both a big enough market. So if the market is big and there's lots of customers that you can go after, and it's how do we win a bunch of market share? And then if you've got great retention with your existing customers. I think the challenges for a lot of startups is they don't know. And so they don't actually know how good their retention is. So it can be really hard to forecast that out. That's why I think understanding retention by cohort and by the size of the customer, understanding retention based on the vertical and the product market fit is actually really important to think about when you're small, because you have less data to work on. So that's one thing. I've seen high churn businesses do really well because year 2, year 3 churn actually looks really good. And so you might have a lot of churn in the first year or 18 months, but then you have a base of customers that then sticks with the product for a long time. And so that's and that's to a certain extent, that's what we saw. And you see that with companies that work with local businesses like Yelp. Companies that work with local businesses, they might have a lot of churn in the early days and, in the first 6 or 12 months. But if you have a stable amount of retention at a certain point, and that chart doesn't continue to go down, then what you can do if your customer acquisition cost isn't too high is you can load a lot of people into the top of that funnel, maybe see a lot of noise and churn in the first 6 or 12 months, but then slowly build that base over time. Again, you've got to have a fairly low customer acquisition cost to do that. That might be a model where you want to employ a freemium model. So, it's sort of, you can figure out sort of the product market fit when they're a freemium customer and not investing too much in marketing to acquire them. There's ways to make that work, but I think it really depends on, I don't have like an earmark, but I will say, these days, if you've got good retention, customer acquisition costs and B2B SaaS are, if you can get them down to 6 months, that's like pretty best in class. And there's a lot of companies that'll pay 12 months for them. So, it really depends based on the customer. Any specific examples I can dig into? I'm sure everyone's got unique metrics for their business. But yeah, churn is really important. Customer acquisition cost is important. And customer acquisition cost will definitely change based off the channel. And so don't make too many assumptions, as you scale, would be my advice.
Okay, that's super interesting. And we have a lot of SaaS finance leaders in this community. So interesting benchmark on the 6 to 12 month payback.
Cool. So we've got 15 minutes left. I'll hit you guys with a couple tips on managing remote sales teams, and then we'll leave it from there. I think the most important thing to understand, and everyone knows this now that we're 12 months into this thing, but if you previously had a sales team that was all in an office, sitting together in cubicles or open floor plan or what have you, making calls, the change for that human being is massive. The fact that they're now working in a living room, maybe with their kids who are doing school over Zoom, maybe they're a little younger and they've got roommates and they're working in their bedroom. These are very challenging situations to be a salesperson, to be cold calling into businesses when you're in your bedroom with your roommates, in the living room, like playing video games or something. I mean, it's unbelievable. So I think the most important thing to do is understand, to whatever extent your team is willing to share, particularly with customer-facing roles, understand what their work setup and life is like. And if there's any way you can help them, you've got to do it, because these are customer-facing employees. They are representing your company day in and day out. If there's anything you can do to help them with a home office, to make them more comfortable, get them a noise canceling headset, all these types of things make a huge difference. And they may not proactively realize the types of tools and things that could help them, create a better sort of work from home situation. There's Series A companies that I've worked with who within 2 months went fully distributed. And part of the reason why is because, they might not be around in 12 months. They're a Series A company. And so why wait 12 months to see what happens? Let's just do it. And it actually gave their employees peace of mind to be like, okay, if I need to move, I can move and not lose my job. And there were a number of employees who had to move because their home setup did not work with their job. And, so they're renting an apartment and they rented a different one. And that made a huge difference for that company to make that decision very quickly. To enable them. So I think that's the first thing you want to realize. Customer facing roles, everyone's had it hard over the past 12 months. If you're in a customer facing role, it's really tough to work from home sometimes. And so keep that in mind. So that's number one when you think about your sales teams. If you go to the next slide, I think the biggest challenge actually has been for the sales managers or the sales directors or the VPs who are used to walking around a sales floor, maybe visiting their field sales team. And now they're looking at a dashboard like, what is my team doing all day long? I have no idea. Are they doing well? Are they not doing well? And you're looking at graphs, trying to figure it out. And you want to have calls with them, but you don't want to just micromanage them all day long because they need to be on the phone or emailing and communicating with customers. And so my advice to sales managers, directors, leaders is definitely have your dashboards, have them set up, have them be automatic. Don't have too many of them. Focus on a couple key input metrics that drive the desired result and then the output. Trust your team, but verify that they're doing it. And most sales leaders I've seen have implemented a morning stand-up. And so every single morning before things get busy, they have a quick meeting with their team and they talk about what they're going to work on that day. They talk about what went well the day before. And then the leader has an opportunity to say, I'm happy to do a quick, stay on after this call if you need anything. I think the consistency of a morning stand-up is really important with a distributed sales team, particularly if a team isn't used to it. It provides a little bit of a break in the day as well versus just waking up and sitting down and reaching out to people. The challenge for the sales leader is how do you do it in a way that isn't micromanaging and demoralizing and demotivating, and how do you keep them interesting? So I filled in for a sales leader who was out for a couple of weeks, and it was a company I was advising. So I actually led the morning stand-ups, and it was important to do little training sessions. It was important to share an interesting blog post. It was important to share customer stories. Doing these quick 5-minute things that, provide something new, a spark of differentiation in your team's day is really important. Just getting on and asking people what deals they're going to close that day, you might as well not even do the morning stand-up. You've got to get more creative than that. You owe it to your team who's in a really tough situation. So I think for a lot of salespeople who are used to an inside sales environment, going to a remote work from home atmosphere has been incredibly challenging. And I think you've got to get really creative on how to make it interesting and support the team. Now, if you have an enterprise team who is in market and maybe used to working in a satellite office and things like that, not that much has changed for them. And so that's the good news. It's really, I think, inside sales that's become really challenging. So I've got a couple tips on the next slide that I'll run through. I've already touched some of them, and then we can do Q&A. So I guess, implementing tools like Slack, of course, Zoom, of course. 15.5 is a great tool for checking in with your team and how they're doing and doing weekly check-ins. Loom is great for async communication. Gong, of course, is critical. You should be, if your country allows it, depending on the regulations, recording calls with your customers is really important, particularly for sales leadership and offering helpful coaching to your team. My one piece of advice is, if you're going to implement a tool, do the training, do the written documentation, do the Loom video that shows them how to use it, but make sure you do those kind of things. It can be really stressful to throw a bunch of tools at a remote team, and if people don't know how to use it, and they don't always raise their hand to say they don't know how to use something. So do that. Definitely embrace async communication. So, you can communicate things in Zoom meetings, but sending videos like Loom videos out so people can digest it on their own time is really important. It can be really stressful to be getting hit with a lot of communication live over a Zoom video. People don't always receive information that way. They need to read it or digest it on their own time. And so async communication is great for that. Clear expectations on daily results or expected results. But I think offering some flexibility on the day-to-day, knowing that some days are going to be better than others. But what's the weekly goal? What's the monthly goal? Are you tracking to that? I've seen be really helpful with sales teams. Consistent communication is really important, but manage to the individual. There will be people on your team who they want to receive a text message from their manager at the end of the day, checking in and saying, how you feeling? How are things going? There are other people who, if they get a text message from their manager at the end of the day when they're trying to wind down and have a glass of wine, they will be thinking about that text message all night long, like wondering if they did something wrong. So consistent communication, different channels of communication, but understanding who that individual is and how they like to be communicated with in that type of environment, I think is really important. Space for sharing knowledge and celebrating wins, doing calls for that, celebrating wins, super important. And then I mentioned trust but verify, which is always the challenge. To make sure you're not micromanaging. So I ran through that quickly, wanting to leave a couple minutes for questions.
Well, those are great tips for any team, I think. So thank you, Pete. And yeah, we're on to the Q&A with a few minutes to spare. So Saeed does have a question. It looks like about sales cycles and just the time it takes to acquire a customer, as that can vary a lot case by case. Mm-hmm. So are there certain benchmarks that are considered strong industry standard?
Yeah, I don't know if I can give a single benchmark. Generally, if an inbound lead comes in, if you don't get a meeting scheduled within a couple days, you can forget about it. It's over. You can put leads in, drip campaigns and things like that, and that's great from an education standpoint. But I wouldn't expect any, revenue from it. As far as outbound and sort of once you are engaging with a client and things like that, generally you should understand the client's timeline for implementing new tools. And so if it's a SaaS product, they should have some sort of sense of, okay, how, what's the process for implementing these types of things? Do you have an immediate need right now that, you're working on? And things like that. So I think, understanding the timeline by asking your customers is really important. Generally, what I would say is if your sales team does not have a next meeting scheduled, then you're in trouble. And so an enterprise timeline might be 3 months, it might be 6 months. If that timeline is on track, you will have that next meeting will always be scheduled. I think when you have an enterprise AE who says, oh, it's going to take, 6 months to get this client in. Okay, well, when's the next meeting? If there isn't a next meeting on the calendar, then that's really time to dig in and really understand, like, okay, what's the situation, with this client? But yeah, I would say enterprises, 3 months minimum, 6 months more likely. SMBs, 2 weeks. If they actually have a need right then and there. If they don't have a need right then and there, you can pretty much forget about it until they do. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful, but definitely varies depending on the product and the customer and the ACV and all that stuff.
Sure, makes sense. Okay, well, we've got a few minutes left. If anyone's been holding their question till the end, feel free to add it in the chat or in the questions tab. I'll wait a couple minutes here. But otherwise, I think this is really helpful for finance folks to have a little more context on how sales leaders are thinking, what questions CEOs and founders are thinking about as they're scaling their companies. And it is something we discuss a lot in our Slack group. I'm surprised sales commission schemes didn't come up yet, but maybe you can talk about that the last few minutes. What are things to keep in mind?
Yeah, I built dozens of comp plans through the years. My general advice around it, there's certain benchmarks. Typically, the sales commission itself should be under 20% of the cost of sale. But of course, it really depends on the customer acquisition cost for a lead and the marketing costs. Commissions, if you're having to pay out more than 20% to a salesperson, then you need to look at the productivity of that person. You need to look at the productivity of the channel itself. Of course, it depends on, you could be closing huge deals that have big growth in the out years where you'll pay more than that. I think the most important thing about commission plans is to keep them simple. Comp plans need to be really simple. If the point is to drive the right behaviors, the sales team needs to know how it works in order to focus on the right things. And generally, comp plans are just like way too complicated. You can make them really complicated in a spreadsheet, and it's easier to understand when it's in a spreadsheet. But the sales team needs to understand it. So I would just say the simpler the better, particularly in the early days, is really important.
And with the startups that you've worked with, I know we've had questions around like multi-year deals and when does that commission get paid out? Does the customer need to, stay for a year, 6 months? What have you seen as a common practice?
Yeah, so typically, generally a hunter-farmer model is what works best, unless, it pretty much always works best. And so typically it's a year cutoff. So the hunter gets paid for the first year, and then the farmer gets paid from there. So you might have 20% on the hunter side, 5 or 10% cost of sale on the farmer side. And that becomes pretty important. As far as multi-year deals, great. I pay for the first year, and once they pay for the second year, then you can pay on that a little bit as well. If they pay for multi years up front, great. If the company gets paid, the AE should get paid. You don't have to pay as much for year 2 and it's year 3, right? But pay something. If you want to incentivize multi-year deals, then you should pay a little bit more for them. If you don't want to incentivize multi-year deals, then don't. It doesn't have to be 2 times or 3 times as much, though. So I think doing something there is important. Generally, the rule is when the company gets paid, the AE gets paid. So if the company doesn't get paid because an account churns or something happens, then the salesperson shouldn't expect to get paid, even if it was out of their control. That's just the way it is. And I think culturally, that's the way it should be. And you should hire teams that are okay with that, particularly in the early days. Startups can't pay commission on revenue that they never receive. So I think that's an important cultural tenet for early sales teams as well. Yeah, makes sense. Okay, great. Well, our time is up. Thank you to everyone who joined us. And Pete, thank you so much for sharing these insights. I know it's super valuable for our community, and we'll share the replay and a recap with everyone so they can revisit this. We can also share your info in case people want to follow up and learn about your consulting work. So thank you so much, Pete. And thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Feel free to reach out on LinkedIn and we'll get my information out. Happy to do one-off questions as I can help. Perfect. Thanks again. Have a good one, everyone. See you next time.